Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am, as always, happy to be with you. I was just thinking about talking to my nieces on the phone the other day. They live in Montana. Four of my nieces live in Montana. One just moved to Oklahoma. But I was talking to the two younger ones who live in Montana, not in my hometown, and they were talking about books. These two are 10 and 15, and we often talk about books when I talk to them on the phone or when we video chat, whatever we're doing. And these young women have opinions. They always have something to say about the books that they are reading, which is awesome. I love that. I love hearing their take on the books. It's so fun, especially when it's a book or a series of books that I have already read. And my youngest niece, who I was reading, I can't even remember. She was reading something the other day. Anyway, something that I had read, and she had so many questions, and I was trying to remember back to when I had read that series and that book, and it was just a lot of fun. And then I have read books that they have recommended, and so then we've been able to chat about that. I don't know. I come from a family of readers, and I just love it. My older nieces love to read as well. And, no, my second oldest niece is 20, and she told me the other day that she doesn't know how to read. I was like, what are you talking about? She was just being a goofball. Apparently she's in a reading slump right now, which is funny because she works at a library. So at least she's still surrounded by books, even if she's in a reading slump. She still has to work somewhere where there are books. But I just thought I would tell you once again that I love my family. I love my nieces. I have 5 nieces, as you probably know. I have several adopted nieces who aren't necessarily mine by relation or anything, but I have multiple of those. And I actually have a couple nephews that fall into that same category. All I can think of is the word acquired, which isn't quite right. I just acquired a new nephew. I just adopted maybe a new nephew. And he's a very sweet kid. He's actually the same age as my second oldest niece. So he's about 20, and he lives in my hometown. And he has the best. He does everything with his hair that I would like to do with my hair, all of the colors, and, changes it on a regular basis. And so I live vicariously through his hair dye choices. Any rate, I just, thinking about my nieces, thinking about books. It's a book podcast. And so, of course, we are here to talk about books. We are here to talk about books by author Michelle Cameron, who is my interview for this episode. We got together to chat recently about her new book. It's called Beyond the Ghetto Gates. It is historical fiction. It is set in the late 18th century, 1796 and 1797. It's a lot of fun because I got to learn something, again, like the recent World War II book, historical fiction novel that I read, that I got to learn something new about World War II, a couple of new things about World War II. At any rate, this time I got to learn something new about Napoleon. Granted, I am not like an authority on Napoleon or anything of that nature, but, I know little bits here and there. At any rate, it's called Beyond the Ghetto Gates, and here is the description from the back of the book. When French troops occupy the Italian port city of Ancona, freeing the city's Jews from their repressive ghetto, two very different cultures collide. Mirelle, a young Jewish maiden, must choose between her duty, an arranged marriage to a wealthy Jewish merchant, and her love for a dashing French Catholic soldier. Meanwhile, Francesca, a devout Catholic, must decide if she will honor her marriage vows to an abusive and murderous husband when he enmeshes their family in the theft of a miracle portrait of the Madonna. And that's it. That's all you get, just enough to suck you into the intrigue. And the interesting thing that I did not know about Napoleon was that first sentence, when French troops occupy the Italian port city of Ancona, freeing the city's Jews from their repressive ghetto. That was Napoleon's doing. And it sounds so much more altruistic than what I expected from Napoleon. And I'll let Michelle talk a little bit more about that in the interview because she explains kind of his motivations behind it. But this is historical fiction. It's women's fiction. And it's always fun for me to read, especially, again, if you are a regular listener of the podcast, then you know that I was a history major with a women's studies minor, and so for me, women's history is always what fascinates me most. So to learn about not only women in this time and this place, but a Jewish woman and a Catholic woman, and watching them try to navigate the world that they live in, while doing so as women, but also as a Jewish woman and a Catholic woman, you know, those things come into play when you are learning about, well, those things come into play in any time and place, but it was very interesting for me to read about them in this particular time and place. So let's go ahead now and get to that interview. Again, the author is Michelle Cameron. The book is Beyond the Ghetto Gates.
Hi, Michelle, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad to have you here, and we are going to be talking about your newest novel. It's called Beyond the Ghetto Gates. Before we get to the book, though, if you would please share a little bit about yourself, that would be wonderful.
Okay. Well, I live in New Jersey, and I have two sons who are grown and flown, as they say. They both live and work in Manhattan, so not too far away, although we haven't seen them nearly as much as we'd like due to the pandemic. But fortunately, they both can work from their apartments, so that's a really good thing. I am in addition to being a writer, I'm director of the Writers Circle. We're a generally New Jersey-based organization that teaches creative writing for everyone from second graders on through adults. Obviously, all of our classes now are virtual, so we've actually expanded both our students and our instructors beyond our local area, and that's been very interesting to do. So, you know, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
All right. Well, the Writer's Circle does sound very interesting, whether virtual or not, and I can only imagine that teaching second graders as your earliest group of creative writing has got to be a lot of fun and maybe a little bit challenging.
It's definitely challenging, and I'm always very grateful it isn't me who's doing it. We have an instructor who is a children's author and has amazing energy, and he just does a phenomenal job with the little ones, and we're just very glad to let him do it.
Yes, everyone has their gifts, and that is good. So let's talk about the book. Again, it is called Beyond the Ghetto Gates. Can you give an overview of that story?
Absolutely. So it takes place in 1796 and 97 when a 26-year-old General Napoleon Bonaparte is charged to chase the Austrians out of Italy. And this campaign is one that, you know, it's sort of opening up a secondary front on the Austrians. He goes to, at one point during the campaign, he arrives in the city of Ancona, which is a harbor city south of Venice. And he discovers there that there are Jews locked behind ghetto gates from sundown to sunrise every day. And what he does is very dramatically, he dispatches a group of Jewish soldiers to demolish those gates and emancipate the Jews that are locked behind those gates. He does this, he follows this up throughout Italy. And so this is, was basically the premise of the story. But of course, it goes beyond the actual events. I have a Jewish and a Catholic pair of women who are really affected by Napoleon's actions. And, it's basically their story I'm telling.
Yeah, and so what was your initial inspiration to tell the story?
Well, my previous novel took place during the Middle Ages and was really about the advent of anti-Semitism in medieval Europe. And as such, it was a really difficult novel to write. I mean, it encompassed things like blood libel and the burning of books and the burning of Jews, actually locked behind in synagogues. And so I was really looking for that very, very rare thing, a joyous moment in Jewish history. And they're not that easy to find, unfortunately. But I was reading a nonfiction book by an author by the name of Michael Goldfarb called Emancipation, How Freeing the Jews from Their Ghetto Led to Revolution and Renaissance. And he depicted this scene that I just described of Napoleon finding the Jews in Ancona and demolishing the gates. And reading that, I'm like, there is definitely a novel here. And so that was the inspiration for the novel.
I can imagine that that this is something about Napoleon that not everybody knows. You have kind of a picture in your head of Napoleon, and this particular act is not one that gets told in his story very often.
It's actually not been told in his story almost at all. I didn't know about it before I discovered it. Many of the readers that I've spoken to said, I've never heard this before. And a lot of them wonder, why Napoleon was so sympathetic to the Jews. And then I always say, well, the answer is he really wasn't. He's such an opportunist. And he just saw that he was trying to sort of paint himself as a real hero back in France. And so he saw this as an opportunity to do that. One of the things that happened during the French Revolution is that Jews became citizens for the first time really in millennia in Europe. And so I think he was sort of following that thread and said, well, this is, as I said, this is an opportunity. I can be a really good guy in doing this. But I don't think he has any innate sympathy for the Jews. And later on, when he becomes emperor, he'll be very frustrated because the Jews don't necessarily want to just be absorbed in the French citizenry. So I think that he had his own agenda going on.
Now, see, that sounds more like Napoleon.
Yes, indeed.
That makes sense.
See, I told you that she would explain it and that, there's a reason why I thought, whoa, Napoleon did that. And then, yeah, it made more sense once we talked about it. So learn something new every day. We are going to go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. And when we come back, more with Michelle Cameron. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere where you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Michelle Cameron. We are currently talking about her new historical fiction novel, Beyond the Ghetto Gates. Let's go ahead and turn again to that interview.
Now, in this case, you were drawn to this time period because of looking for something that was a little more positive in terms of Jewish history. But normally when you sit down to write historical fiction, do you start with a certain time or a certain event or a certain location? How does that work for you?
I think it's really has been varied. My first novel, again set during the Middle Ages, I wrote that mainly because it was about a 13th century ancestor of mine. So that's what drew me to that one. This one, I think it was very much the event itself, the story. And I've always been fascinated by Napoleon, so that didn't hurt either. So, and I've written actually another book which has not yet been published, which takes place all the way back in the Babylonian era. So that's, so I jump around in history, but it's all, except for my very first book, it's all been tied to Jewish history. I think that's the common theme.
And I noticed on your when I was looking at your website recently that you say that you said something along the lines of, I'm not particularly religious, but I'm still drawn to tell these stories. And of course, with Judaism, there is the religious aspect, but there's also the cultural aspect and the historical aspect. So, what do you think has been drawing you to Judaic history?
I think a lot of it is because it is my history. It's one of these things where my parents moved me to Israel when I was a teenager. I got a very deep dive into Jewish history because I finished high school in Israel, and that's part of the curriculum. So I think on one hand, I know a lot more than the typical American Jew would know about the history of the Jewish people. But also, I simply feel like this belongs to me in a lot of ways, whether I'm religious or not. And a lot of the themes that I talk about, particularly the theme of assimilation versus safeguarding religious traditions, is a theme that I think a lot of American Jews resonate with. It's kind of the Christmas problem. Do you have a tree? Don't you have a tree? What happens when you have relatives who celebrate Christmas? So it's that really very much, again, as I said, belongs to me. So those are the things I write about.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And I could just go off on a tangent and explore your teenage years in Israel. I think that would be very interesting, but I won't.
That's okay. We can come back to it.
There's always so many stories that I want to be like, oh, let's talk about that for a half an hour. And I'm like, wait, you're recording a podcast. Stop that. So, as you mentioned, there are two female characters in the book, and one is Jewish, one is Catholic. The Jewish woman's name is it Mireya?
Morel.
Morel. Okay, I wasn't sure how the L's were pronounced. So Morel and Francesca. Can you talk a little bit about each of them and what about them that might resonate with readers?
Sure, absolutely. So Morel is what I often term as my feisty heroine. And I have a problem with feisty heroines. She's very proactive. She's faced with a dilemma. She wants to work in her father's workshop and contribute to his legacy. He makes ketubot, the singular is ketuba. These are these gorgeous illuminated Jewish marriage certificates. And Ancona at this point in time was was the world center of ketubah making. Her mother and the city rabbi don't want to allow her to do that. They want her to sort of go the traditional route, to marry well, to marry someone wealthy. That at least her mother wants her to do that part of it, and to raise children and be a good Jewish housewife. So one of the difficulties I have in creating authentic characters that will still resonate with a 21st century readership is that they can't be too passive. And Morel, in a lot of ways, started out being much more passive because I was reaching more for the authenticity. And my beta readers all told me, no, she's got to do more for herself. And so she evolved over many, many revisions of the novel. So what I think resonates with current day readers is that she does know what she wants. And even though she's blocked from doing it for a good portion of the novel, she still has that hankering, she has that longing to do the thing that she feels is really her deepest desire. In terms of Francesca, this is a very different situation. Francesca is very much trapped in a marriage that to an abusive husband who eventually becomes actually a murderer. And she feels an obligation to him because of what her the priests and the church is telling her, that once married, there's no out. She can't divorce him, because being a devout Catholic, and she is very devout, and that she's sort of told, you have to help him, you have to do things for him. And so she struggles with that. The other side of Francesca is that she has been brought up to revile Jews. Again, this was very common in this period of time, and unfortunately, often in our period of time as well. And so again, she's been taught by the priests, by her society, that Jews are not to be trusted. And then she meets a Jewish soldier, Daniel, and she starts to question those beliefs. And one of my deepest hopes for this novel is that, people will read it, understand more about the Jewish history, and understand more, sort of go through the same transformation that Francesca does, perhaps.
Yeah, and one thing that I appreciate about historical fiction is what you just said, that you can view a certain period and a certain way, certain actions through the eyes of the characters, so you can kind of understand what was going on and why situations were as they were. But I wanted to touch back on what you said about Mirelle and how she's a feisty character. And it's so easy to take our 21st century ideas of what she should do, but the reality was that she was a young, not only Jewish, but she was a woman. It's 1796, and it's very patriarchal, and she was expected to behave a certain way, and she had to live within the confines of her surroundings, even if she is fictional.
Right. No, absolutely. And she's faced with a real dilemma, which is she falls for a Catholic French soldier. And to the point where she considers running away with him. But she does feel an intense duty toward her family. So there's definitely a struggle that goes on, with that. She's also betrothed to marry a much older man, and who's actually turns out to be her best friend's father. which again was not unusual in this period of time. If you read Regency fiction, a lot of times older men would marry much, much younger women, especially if they didn't have a male heir. So there's a lot of both internal and external struggle that poor Morel has to face.
Right, and each woman, not only is she faced with the strictures of the time from being a woman, but each of them has to come to terms with their own faith, their own religiosity, because it is still there are still ideas of what women should be allowed to do in both Judaism and Catholicism. You mentioned that Francesca is in this terrible relationship, but of course her priest is going to tell her, the Bible says you have to be, you have to submit to your husband. There's all of these things. You cannot, this is your lot. This is what God has given you. And that can be, I think, really hard for modern readers, even though it's still, those problems can still exist in modern times.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, so as I said, they both struggled, which I think, yeah.
All right. Now that you've listened to me babble my way through that last question, geez, let's go ahead and take another break so we can all recover from that babble fest. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Let's go ahead and see if I can get through the rest of the interview babble-free while I am speaking with Michelle. Don't hold your breath. But, it could happen. It could be a miracle. Let's go ahead and see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. How much research did you do for the book?
Oh, so much. It's funny because I'm in the midst of researching the sequel, and it's just reminding me how much research goes into every one of the books the historical fiction that I write. I will, obviously, I own a lot of books about the period, about, Napoleon himself, about the dress and the food. I love going to I love going to libraries and getting more books. I also love going to museums. I mean, I'm, again, very fortunate to live outside of New York, where you can go to the Metropolitan Museum, for example, and they have these gorgeous period rooms. And I just wish they'd let me, in there and be able to sit for hours, but they never let me do that.
So rude.
Yes, I know. It's really terrible. And then, artwork and all of that. So I do a tremendous amount of research, and every once in a while there is a real surprise that crops up, and particularly in this novel, there were two major surprises that contributed greatly to the plot of the book. One I've already mentioned, which is the fact that Ancona, Italy, was the world center of ketubah making, these gorgeous marriage certificates. I mean, the artisans of Ancona were the first to ever illuminate them. And they have this very distinctive shape, which is called an ogee arch, which was, you know, incredibly useful to me because I did travel to a few other cities, throughout the process of researching the book, etc. Um, and I would come upon an exhibit of Judaica and see a ketubah hanging on the wall, and 9 times out of 10, it would be a ketubah from Ancona, and I would recognize it because of the shape. But this gave Morel kind of a home for, her personal passion. The second surprise was that in the cathedral, up on one of the 3 mountains that surround the harbor, there's this gorgeous cathedral there. And in it, they had a portrait of the Virgin Mary. And Francesca Maratti is actually a real person who was the first to witness the miracle of this portrait turning its head and crying, which caused an uproar in Ancona and was repeated in several other cities throughout Italy at the time. The reason I say Francesca was a real life person is that actually one of my students helped me find this document from the Vatican, which related the entire incident. And there was also this lovely anecdote about how Napoleon, who was in the midst of looting the cathedral, which he did all the way throughout Italy. I mean, this was just something he was doing. Encountered the portrait, and something he saw in it kind of spooked him. And so he described that he lifted this gold cloth and threw it over the portrait, which, you can't resist if you're a historical novelist. I mean, that story is just too good.
Absolutely.
I will say that everything that happens to the portrait after that moment is completely invented. So, but again, it was research-driven surprise that helped me tremendously with the plot.
Yeah, that's really cool. And actually, you answered one of my I was going to follow up with a question of have you traveled to Ancona, and you said that you've been there. So obviously pre-pandemic. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, actually, no. I've been to other cities. A lot of my travel has to do with where my family wants to go.
Oh, okay.
So I actually have not been to Ancona, although I'm dying to get there. So a lot of what I learned about Ancona, I had to learn from images from other people who traveled there, travel itineraries. Internet has gorgeous photos of it. So I'm hoping still to get there. But I will say one of the nicest things that somebody said to me as I was talking with a book club, and a woman mentioned she'd been there, and she said, I was remembering what it was like to walk up those steep streets the whole time I was reading it. And I'm like, thank goodness, I must have gotten it right.
That's good. Yeah. I mean, at least in this day and age, we have the internet and Google Maps and all kinds of helpful things, even if we can't go everywhere we want to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're working on the sequel now. What can you say about the sequel without giving too much away, if it ties in with this book, or, what can you say about it?
Sure. So Napoleon does this very odd thing immediately after this. In the next 2 years, he takes this expedition, this military expedition, to Egypt and to Israel. Again, not history people know too much about. And in fact, he faces his first defeat in Akko in Israel. So both Daniel and Christoph will be part of the troop that accompany him to Egypt and to Israel. Whereas, Morel will be in correspondence with Daniel. And so their stories will continue. And there are some really interesting moments that happen, both in terms of just Napoleon turned out to be very impatient during this campaign, and that didn't work out for him too well. But also just in terms of the Jewish side of the story, where he actually hinted at the establishment of a Jewish state if the Jews in Israel in particular would help him, which has been contested by historians, but again, sort of is a fascinating, story to explore in fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because you can imagine all kinds of ways that conversation may have gone, because we don't know if that conversation actually happened.
No, exactly, and so it's going to be a really interesting book to write. And one of the nice things about this one is that I did take a trip with my family to Israel. Haven't been to Egypt, but been to Israel. And so I did a little pilgrimage to a number of the places where Napoleon had been. And I know that's going to enrich the book tremendously.
Was Napoleon a historical figure that you were interested in before you started researching for these books?
To a degree. When I was 14 years old, my sister handed me a book by the name of Desiree by Anna Marie Salenko. And this is actually a novel about the real life, Napoleon's real life first love, who eventually becomes Queen of Sweden. And so sort of my fascination with Napoleon started there. I would say it lay dormant for many, many years until, again, I started researching this book. But I acknowledge Desiree, in my author's note.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. In terms of writing, when did you start writing, and is it something that you've always wanted to do or something you came to later in life? How did that work for you?
So it was definitely something that I've wanted to do, I would say, since the fourth grade. When I remember writing and illustrating this odd little futuristic story, very Jetson-esque. And I did actually write three novels before getting to my first book, which is a verse novel about William Shakespeare in the Globe Theater. And I'm very, very grateful that none of those three books ever got published, because they were very much practice books. But with the third one, which was based on, it was a young adult novel about Shakespeare in the Globe Theater. I thought that one was going to go, and when it didn't, I kind of gave up on writing for a while. And I was brought back to it by my youngest son, who himself is a gifted writer, and he's actually the Alex who the book is dedicated to. Because from a very young age, he just would sit down and write. I mean, he's such a born writer. And so I kind of looked at him and I said, well, I can write for the joy of it. I don't have to write for publication. And so I started actually at that point writing poetry, because with a young family, poetry is so much easier to write and complete something rather than a whole long novel. And that's sort of what got me back into writing. And then after the verse novel, I wrote The Fruit of Her Hands, which is the medieval novel, and that one definitely needed to be a full novel. So that's kind of where I got back to novel writing.
Time for the last break of the podcast. When we come back, Michelle will be talking more about the Writers Circle that she mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Michelle Cameron, and as I said before the break, we are now going to talk a little bit more about the Writers Circle. Ignore the fact that when I ask the question, I refer to it as the Writers Group. It's a circle, not a group. Let's return now to that interview.
Then when did the Writers Group come into play in your career?
So I was working for a terrible day job, and sort of sneaking in writing by getting up at 4:30 in the morning to write. And so after The Fruit of Her Hands was published, I went and I taught at a different workshop. I was invited to teach at a different workshop, and I realized how much I loved teaching about writing. And so I came home after that and started to try and see, what I could possibly do. And Judith Lindbergh had founded the Writers Circle about a year before, and it was very much a one-woman show at that point. So I sort of got together with her and said, I'd love to join you. And we did that. And so I've been very fortunate to sort of build my life around what I call the writing life, because either I'm teaching writing or I'm helping to run the Writer's Circle or I'm doing my own writing.
Very nice. Sounds like a very inclusive and submersive. I don't think that's the right word, but maybe know what I'm
know
saying.
Yes, no, it's really lovely, and I mean, Julie and I often look at each other and say, "Well, it beats working," even though it's so much work.
Right, exactly. Do you then, from your own writing or from your teaching experience, have advice for aspiring authors?
Absolutely. And one is to find other writers. I mean, this helped me tremendously. Because back when I was getting back into writing, I would write things and sort of stick them in a drawer. And it was by meeting other writers and having some writing mentors that I really was encouraged to start to, once again, to try and get published, first with the poetry and then with the novels. And so writing is such a solitary act for the most part, but and so many people don't understand why you would take so much time out of your day to do it, but other writers understand. And I'm very proud of the writing community that we've built with the Writers Circle. And hopefully this isn't a story I'm not allowed to tell, but we just got news that 2 of our students are actually getting married, which is like amazing. But yeah, no, I mean, just finding other writers, whether that be through courses or whether that just be getting together with a group of other writers, it just helps so much because it's something you love to do, but other people just don't get it.
Right. Unless you experience it, you don't always understand what goes into it. Yeah. When you have the time to read for yourself, and maybe you do and maybe you don't since you do a lot of research, but what authors and genres are you drawn to for personal reading?
I can't fall asleep at night unless I read fiction. I just can't. So I'm constantly reading. I'm a very eclectic reader, but naturally, the thing I gravitate towards most is historical fiction. So I will read, as much as that as I can get my hands on. I'm also, and it's not really historical fiction, but I'm a huge Jane Austen fan. And one of the real pleasures is that of writing Beyond the Ghetto Gates was that I allowed myself to reread all of Jane Austen because, of course, it's that time period. And that helped me, just get a sense of the time. So, yeah, definitely historical fiction. But like I said, I will read pretty much anything. Not a huge horror or suspense fan. But other than that, I read pretty much everything.
Wow, you sound like my book twin. Love Jane Austen, not a huge horror fan, need to read at night before I go to sleep.
Absolutely.
We can be book besties.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where they can find your website and where they might be able to interact with you on social media.
Sure. So my website is michelle-cameron.com. I have a Twitter account, but I will say I don't go on Twitter as much as a lot of other writers, but I am at mcameron, MCAMERON _writer. I'm much more on Instagram and Facebook. So Instagram is all one word, Michelle Cameron Writer, and my author page on Facebook is Michelle Cameron Author. So there you go.
All right, easy enough. Thank you. Michelle, we've talked about a number of different things during our time together, but is there anything that you had wanted to talk about that you haven't had a chance to before now?
I've been doing a lot of Zoom calls with book clubs, with Jewish organizations, with non-Jewish organizations. I'm actually really excited. I'm going to be going to an interfaith organization in Philadelphia I believe it's in January. So I'm incredibly happy to zoom into any of those, and to interact with readers in that way. And so that would be tremendous. And there is a contact form on my website to be able to get in touch with me. And so, yeah, I've been really enjoying that.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, that sounds really fun. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, not only about Beyond the Ghetto Gates, but about some of your other novels as well. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I've had, my pleasure in speaking with you as well today, Sarah.
I just love talking to authors. I know, I say it a lot, but it's true. And when something is true, you should say it. I love talking to authors and chatting with them about, I know I ask them all about what they read and how they write and all those things, but I genuinely find that stuff fascinating. I seriously have more books on my TBR list than will ever get read, but I still like to know what other people are reading. I'm just nosy that way. And I loved talking with Michelle, and thank you again, Michelle, for joining me on the podcast to talk about not only Beyond the Ghetto Gates, but some of your other works as well. Again, I really enjoyed that this is historical fiction. I enjoyed that it is women's fiction, that I learned something new about Napoleon, learned a little bit more about the Napoleonic era. I actually realized that I don't know a lot about Napoleon, just kind of the stuff that you learn in your world history class in college when you're a history major or when you're just taking a world history class. You know, kind of the highlights, the ups, the downs, the Waterloo, short man syndrome, hand in his coat pocket, or not in his coat pocket, hand in his jacket, all of those things. And so it was kind of fun to learn a little bit more about a character, or not a character, a historical figure that you do hear about a lot, but maybe not in the detail that makes up a complex human being who did a lot more in his or her life than we learn about in our 100 level world history classes necessarily. So thank you, Michelle. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. And as always, if you're a fan of this podcast, please do go ahead and leave us a review, whether that's written or 5-star. It's fabulous when you leave the reviews because it helps get that podcast out to other book lovers. It's not so much about me. It's more about getting this podcast out to as many people who love books as we possibly can. So thank you for writing reviews, doing reviews, all of that good stuff. Also follow us on social media. I love to hear from listeners. So Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are your options for that. Please know that my Instagram page is not nearly as pretty as Michelle's Instagram page. You should go visit her Instagram page also because, wow. But, please do also follow our less colorful. Maybe I should step up my color game. I'll do that. I will try to step up my color game on our Instagram account and make it a little more vibrant. How's that sound? If you'll come follow me. Anyway, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, GSMC Book Review, and please do leave comments. Tell me about the books that you're reading. Tell me about the books that you want to be reading. Tell me about books that you think are overrated. Tell me about books that you think are overhyped. Tell me about books that you will read 10 times in a row or, once a year. All of those good things. I love to hear from listeners. I hope you will join me next time when I will be speaking with author Anne Crawford about her newest novel. Nope, it's her second newest novel. And it is called Life in the Hollywood Lane. And it talks about a young woman who moves to Hollywood. That doesn't really even begin to cover everything that happens in this book. It's a lot more in-depth than that. But that'll maybe pique your interest. It's a Hollywood story, and the voice of the protagonist, Trish, is just hilarious and kind of reminds me of the voice in my own head. So definitely join me on Tuesday's podcast for that episode. Thank you again. I hope you have a great weekend, and I hope, as always, that you find plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.